Ah, well, now, um, I'll tell you some stories about my time working in the Perth Museum. I worked in the museum in Perth part time. I worked in the factory, in the wire factory at Central Wire full time, but I had this other part time job too, which was on weekends, a full day on Saturday and oftentimes a half day on Sunday. And this back in the 1980s when I was young, you know. Anyway, our boss, the curator of the museum, was a man who had lost his right arm in a car accident. So he actually had a hook. He had a mechanical hook for an arm. He had this mechanical thing there attached to what was left of his arm, to his stump, and it had cables and everything running down it, and on the end of it, it had a steel hook, a shiny steel hook that curved around, and the hook actually opened up too. It would do this, along the length of it. And he had a way of working the cables with the muscles of his shoulder and so on to make the hook open and close and to make the arm move and so on. And he had a wicked stutter. And I found out after some years later that oftentimes losing an arm like that will kind of bugger you up. And it was something about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And a result of that can be a really bad stutter. So that may be the case with him. Anyway, yeah, quite a thing anyway. But he was our boss. He was the curator. And there's a few things about the old museum. I'll tell you a few stories about it. It was actually in an old house called the Matheson House, which belonged to a man by the name of Roderick Matheson. Back in the 1840s, that was his family home. He was quite a wealthy person. And the store next door, which was, when I was young, was called Shaw's of Perth. That had been Roderick Matheson's business. He had actually built the store next door, which is on the corner. The building is still there. Both buildings are still there. And Roderick Matheson had built that store anyway, and that was his business. But we had a picture, a painted picture, in the front hall of the building, of the house, at the back of the front hall by where the door to the kitchen would be. And we had a Heppo white table underneath, like a side table, on up against the wall underneath that picture. At night, when we went home, the picture would be hanging on the wall. In the morning, the picture would be on the table, face down on the table. This would happen continuously. The picture would be laying face down. It wouldn't be. We'd have to hang it up again every day. And that picture, that painted portrait, was a portrait of Roderick Matheson's 9-year-old son, who had been killed in an accident on the street directly in front of the house. Apparently, he had ran out of the house. He was on his way to school, and he had ran out of the house into the street, and he got run over by a horse, with a horse-drawn cart or whatever. It ran him over, and he was killed. 9 years old. Anyway, it was a portrait of him, and every day that portrait would be laying face down on the table when we'd come in the morning. If you went up the stairs, if you came in for the front door, there were the stairs. Okay, you get your front door here where my head is. Then ahead of my head, you had the stairs. To the right, to your right, you had the dining room, which was like a formal dining room. It had a big table and all the rest of it in there. It was a very formal dining room. It was done up in 1840s style. To the left, there was a room where we had a huge mineral collection, one of the biggest mineral collections in Canada, actually. We had geologists from all over the world come and visit to see that mineral collection. So it was full of display cases, basically full of rocks, all different kinds of rocks. If you went straight ahead to the back of the building, past the staircase went up like this, and the hallway got narrower to the side of the staircase. If you went straight back, there was a doorway there that went into the kitchen, to the original kitchen of the house, which when I first arrived there, we were using as a workshop. Didn't look anything like it did back in its time. Now, eventually, they did restore that back to the 1840s style. They uncovered the fireplace and everything. There was a big fireplace for cooking in there. They uncovered that, and so on. And anyway, that happened eventually. And they also eventually built an addition to the museum at the back of the museum, which is called the Winifred Inderwick Edition, because she was a big patron of the museum. Very nice lady, very lovely lady. I had conversations with her when I worked there a few times. Really a wonderful person. She was quite elderly when I knew her in the mid-1980s, and she's been gone a very long time now. But anyway, Winifred Inderwick was a huge supporter of the museum, and so, like I say, we all knew her very well. She was a frequent visitor to the museum, and also attended board meetings, and she attended the grand opening when we opened up the Winifred Inderwick Wing, named in her honor, and so on. Anyway, we opened that up in 1986. But anyway, getting back to the stories. Up in the drawing room, which if you went straight up the stairs, there was a landing. Up the stairs, there's a landing, and then there was another set of stairs that went right up to the top floor. Now, the top floor at one time had all been bedrooms, but the walls had been knocked out of it years before, because that building was used as the Royal Canadian Legion Hall. And so they had made a big, like a dance hall upstairs, a banquet hall, dance hall kind of a deal. And so that had been bedrooms, but they were all gone. We had a gallery up there with big display cases full of artifacts, is what we had up there. But on the second level, anyway, above the old where the 1840s kitchen was the drawing room, and it was not unusual to hear conversations coming from the drawing room, even when there was nobody up there. There was a man that had a very low, gravelly voice, and there was a woman that had a very high-pitched voice, and you couldn't make out what they were saying, but you could hear the conversation. You just couldn't understand it. Anyway, we used to hear that quite often. One time I was coming down the stairs, and I actually got pushed. Somebody shoved me from behind. I turned around and there was nobody there. I actually had to catch myself on the banister because something or someone tried to push me down the stairs. Anyway, yeah, and there were people who saw that too, including my youngest sister, because she had been visiting my dad in town, and she came over to see me. She was only about 6 years old at the time, but she remembers standing there at the bottom of the stairs and watching me when I got pushed down, when I nearly got killed by some unseen force anyway. That was the thing, but there used to be things like that happening all the time. I had a little office off the mineral room. With my job, I did have a little office. I was in charge of guides and whatnot, so I had this little office, and a tour guiding, type deal. For the museum, we had people hired to conduct tours. Anyway, so I had this little office, and I used to come sometimes late at night. I had keys to the building, and I used to come and do paperwork. I had a typewriter in there, a desk with a typewriter and all that, and I used to do paperwork. And of course, I had a transistor radio. It was just an AM radio. Well, back in the 80s, though, AM radio was still king, really, Especially around here, you couldn't really get much on an FM radio around here anyway. And of course, at night, you get the static and you get stations. You get what they call crosstalk, where you get one station coming in over another station. So you'd be listening to music and then you'd hear somebody talking over top of the music because another station was coming in. And sometimes it was barely perceptible, but you'd hear it, you know. Anyway, just to set the tone for you, I was in there one night, clickety clacking on my typewriter, listening to my radio. And like I say, AM radio, so I was getting the static and the crosstalk and everything over top of whatever I was listening to. I was listening to some music, you know. Anyway, I thought I heard somebody say, "Get out," from behind me. I thought I heard somebody say, "Get out." No, I was sitting with my back to the door. When I sit at my desk, my back would be to the door. And I heard somebody say, "Get out," I thought. But then I kind of chalked it up just to crosstalk on the radio, because I was clickety clacking away on the old manual typewriter, and I had this radio playing, and I thought it was just background noise on the radio or whatever, you know. So I kind of stopped and I kind of looked around, and I was just on the radio, and I kept typing, and then I heard it again loud, and it was a booming voice, and it said, "Get out! Get out of me house!" Just like that. And it was right behind me. And of course, the room behind me where the mineral collection was in total darkness. I just had a lamp, like a floor lamp, standing there beside my desk. And that was the only light in there, was from that floor lamp. Well, I'll tell you, I never got out of a place so quickly in all my life. A Scottish accent, too, and Roderick Matheson was Scottish. I guess he didn't like late-night visitors anyway to his house, so clickety-clacking and listening to music and all that, you know. So here's what he said. He said, "Get out! Get out of me house!" Just like that. Anyway, I was gone. I'll tell you, it scared me half to death. But that was another incident anyway at the museum. Oh, sometimes we used to have people when we were conducting tours that liked to handle the artifacts. Now, this was a bit of a problem because some artifacts, and many people wouldn't know this about museums, but sometimes if there's an artifact, say, sitting on a table or a desk, and it looks like it's solid and intact, it really isn't. It might actually be in three pieces, and it's just kind of put together and sat there, but if you pick it up and start handling it, it'll fall apart. You know, and there's just things like that, you know, so... And even if it is all in one piece, if you break it, you know, this isn't easy stuff to get. These are things that are well over 100 years old. You know, you can't just, like I used to tell people, because people used to be picking stuff up and handling it, and I would say, but please don't handle the artifacts. Or sometimes you get, why not? Well, because if it breaks, we can't run across the street to Stedman's department store. At that time, there was a Stedman's a store across the street called Stedman's department store. I said, we can't just run across the street to Stedman's department store and get another one. You know, please put it down. Please don't handle the artifacts. Well, some people were good about it and some weren't. Some people get ugly about it, you know. But still, we couldn't have them handling the artifacts. Even we didn't handle the artifacts any more than we had to do our jobs. Like, yes, I did handle artifacts. That was part of my job. But I was trained as to how to do it, for one thing. And I also knew every artifact in there intimately, so I knew all its weaknesses. If it was something that was put together in 3 or 4 pieces, I knew. You know, I knew that was the case, so I knew how to handle it. And the other thing is, even I, with the training I had and the knowledge I had of the artifacts, didn't touch those artifacts unless it was necessary to do my job. You know, because too much handling of these things will wear them down and break them, you know. So, you know, our job in the museum was to preserve history and to preserve the artifacts, not to destroy them, not to break them, you know. Anyway, there were different things that happened in the museum. And everybody had experiences there, really weird experiences. Yeah, anyway, at one point, believe it or not, and I tell this story in another video, I actually handled the wallet. I handled a wallet that was made from the skin of a condemned man. The man's name was Thomas Easby, and he was put to death on a makeshift gallows in the middle of Drummond Street in Perth, Ontario, right in front of the courthouse. And he was hanged there. And the reason he was hanged there is he had murdered his family. He had went through the house in the middle of the night with a hatchet, and he killed each one of them in their beds, his wife and the children. When the toddler, his son, who was a toddler, when he went to kill his son in his bed, his son was the last one left. He saved him for last. When he went to kill his little boy in the bed, the little boy woke up and looked up at him. And here he had the hatchet up, he was getting ready to bring it down on the little boy's head. And he couldn't do it. Whatever, that snapped him out of it. He couldn't do it. So he picked the little boy up and he carried him outside. And then he went back in and he smashed a lantern, and a coil lantern, and that's how the fire started. He had this coil lantern that was lit and he smashed it. Anyway, of course, he said it was all an accident. The lantern had fallen and smashed, burnt the house down. He managed to get his son out, but unfortunately everyone else had perished. That wasn't an uncommon situation in those days, so he was believed. The story wasn't looked into too closely. He ended up, his young son, who he saved, or who he didn't kill, who the public felt or thought that he had saved, was adopted. He was taken in by some neighbors down the road and raised by them. And his son, he kept telling this story about waking up with his dad with the hatchet and then being carried outside and then the fire starting and his dad coming out of the house. And they didn't believe him, and they were punishing him for lying to them. But eventually, he kind of wore them down telling this story, and they thought, maybe there's something to it. He's still telling the story. We've been pretty hard on him for lying, and yet he's still telling the story, so maybe we should look into it. So they went to the sheriff, and the sheriff did some investigating. The sheriff actually dug up the wife's body, and he found a wound in her head that matched perfectly a hatchet head that he found in the fire, in what was left of the cabin, in the ashes, basically. And so Thomas Easby was sentenced to death, and he was hanged for murder. The crowd was so angry, though, because he duped everybody, and so he fooled everybody. People thought he was a hero. They couldn't do enough for him, and turns out he just murdered his family and torched his own house. Anyway, they were pretty upset about all that, so his body was turned over to the tanner. He was skinned after he was hanged, and his skin was turned into leather. And they say a little square of leather, 2 inches by 2 inches, was selling for $2, which was a working man's wage. I forget for how long now, but for a very long time, like months, take a working man months to earn that kind of money, $2 in those days. Anyway, we had a wallet that was made out of that man's skin, out of leather from that man's skin, and I actually handled that. So I actually held it in my hand, this wallet made of this man's skin, Anyway, so that was kind of creepy, but yeah. So anyway, it was interesting, though. It was very interesting work in a lot of ways. I enjoyed a lot of aspects of it. I didn't enjoy it all, but I enjoyed parts of it. Like any job, there's parts you like and parts you don't like. But yeah, um, they oh, what else was I going to say about it now? There were different things anyway that would happen. There was an attic to the building. And of course, the public wasn't allowed up there, but I was up there different times. And in the attic, you could actually see where the servants slept. They slept between the rafters in the attic, and you could even see the nails and the hooks where they hung their clothes and whatnot, you know. And there was also an old tin bathtub up there that they had used. So yeah, that was kind of neat anyway, to be able to go up there to see things that the public just wouldn't get to see normally, you know. But sometimes we kept the door to the attic locked because we didn't want people wandering up there. And sometimes, though, the doorknob, you'd hear footsteps coming down the stairs on the other side of the locked door, and then the doorknob would do this. You know, the doorknob would be moving. Well, of course, I would run downstairs and get the key to the attic and come all the way back up. And you'd see the doorknob would still be doing this, you know. I'd stick the key in the lock and turn it, and the doorknob would stop turning. And I'd open the door, there'd be nobody on the other side of it. That happened many times. So yeah, it was an interesting place anyway. It was called the Matheson House Museum. And it's on Gore Street East in Perth, Ontario, Canada. It's a former Legion Hall. It was also a tea room and a boarding house at one time, prior to being the Legion Hall. They say Roderick Matheson's daughters lived in that house. After Roderick Matheson passed away, they lived there until they got to be quite old and they passed away. And they lived in poverty, though the family fortune was gone, and they were living in poverty in there. In fact, they had even broken up some of the furniture to burn it for heat in the wintertime. Things were that bad for them. So yeah, kind of sad anyway. But Roderick's son was killed when he was 9 on the street right out front there, and that's the kid whose portrait I was telling you about that would come off the wall and be laying face down on the table every morning. It was kind of eerie, you know, it really was. And I had to work in there by myself sometimes. And I'll tell you, it was being in there by yourself wasn't very yeah, no. And especially after that incident in my office where I was yelled at to get out, um, I didn't like being in there by myself, you know. Anyway, that's it, guys. That's all there is to write. This was all in the mid-1980s, around 1984, 85, 86, in there when I was there working. Anyway, we'll see you later.